So we're going to cover chapter 1 and maybe even start some of chapter 2 today. Chapter 1 is pretty short, I think. There's not a whole lot necessarily in it that's new to any of you. And we talked about this a little bit last time. How many species do you think there are on Earth? Too many. Great answer.
Is this including bacteria?
Do you want to exclude? Well, bacteria we don't really subdivide into species. We do clades, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
So we'll say exclusive of bacteria and archaea. How many eukaryotic species? Millions? 50 million, maybe? We don't really know. We discover new species every single year, but that's a lot of species to share this planet with. So sustainability does matter because of needing to balance our needs versus those of other living things. And one of the main concerns is that we seem to be we live sort of in a disposable society, is one way of looking at it. How long is your cell phone going to last you? A year, maybe 2. Is Apple in trouble right now for the way they handle batteries to help enforce the disposability of our cell phones and electronic devices? How many of you have an iPhone and are really upset about this? A number of years ago, Dell got in trouble for this with laptop batteries. They had some sort of a switch built into them that after the laptop had charged 200 or 300 times, the battery would no longer charge. The laptop would still work as long as it was plugged in, but the battery would no longer charge. And people then discovered it because they took their batteries apart and they found something that wasn't supposed to be there. And your workaround was to just buy a new battery from the people who made the battery and not from the company, because then it could last even longer. Are there other things that are seen as disposable? Cars, clothes, home goods. Sometimes you buy a food item and you discover there's far more weight in packaging than there was of food inside of it. I don't remember which grocery store it was, but there was one that recently was trying to individually package in like plastic, like apples and oranges for purchase, and people were like, absolutely not. You're trying to appeal to people who are trying to eat fruit. What makes you think they want each individual item like shrink wrapped in plastic? Also, that's not good for the fruit, for ripening and over ripening problems. And people were like, you can't do this. They changed their policies. Because human wants and needs do drive a lot of what we do, but we need a planet that is sustainable, that we can live on sustainably. See how many of these things you are familiar with. What is ecology? Can you give me a definition?
It's like a study of how the environment interacts with itself.
A study of the interactions of animals, plants, living organisms with their environment, how they all impact each other, what the interrelationships are. Mm-hmm. And did you guys cover in any classes before the difference between a food web and a food chain? So a food chain is going to be like a singular energy pathway, looking at one organism and what it eats and what it is eaten by. But a food web is going to look at everything in the ecosystem as they link together for food. And a food web is always going to usually include the detritivores as well, and the bacteria. So it's going to include the things that do the decomposing, which releases the chemicals back into the ecosystem. as well as the things that we think of as living creatures that are eating food. Biosphere is life on Earth. Atmosphere, you probably know what that is. The lithosphere or the geosphere, depending upon which term you want to use, for the solid rock and soil and things that make Earth. And then we have the hydrosphere, the water. Those are our different 4 interacting spheres when we talk about Earth. That's really more from an earth science perspective, probably than a biological perspective. And are you familiar with the scientific method and how we develop hypotheses? Of course you are. And everybody's taken at least one course in basic chemistry at some point in time. The conservation of matter and the laws of thermodynamics are also going to come into play a lot in environmental science and ecology issues, because frequently when we're trying to utilize things for human needs and balance human needs with the environment, we sometimes find ourselves fighting against these. We'll talk about resources that are renewable versus those that are not. And that's going to come back to a lot of times a loss of heat and a loss of tangible items related to laws of thermodynamics. Because every time we change something from one form to another, and every time we change energy from one form to another, some is going to be lost. So we have our atmosphere, our geosphere, our biosphere, hydrosphere, all interacting here. The conservation of matter comes into another play with this picture. Can you throw something away? Technically, yes, but it has to go someplace else. We don't have any way of really physically getting rid of matter. It's always going to become something else or have to go someplace else. What do you think about sending trash into space?
Good idea theoretically, if you can get outside of Earth's gravitational pull, but that costs like a couple million every time you want to do it.
The 2 main things there are the cost and making sure we actually get it out far enough so that it doesn't come crashing back onto us. But it's come up as an idea. For a long time, New Jersey, New York, a number of other states just dumped all their trash in the ocean. Which sounds like one plan, right? Because it's gone, because you can't see it anymore. But then in the 1980s, they had a large problem with hypodermic needles from medical waste washing up in beaches. And, well, maybe we can't dump medical waste in the ocean just offshore anymore because it comes back. Then people have this big fear about getting hepatitis or AIDS or HIV from being stuck by these needles at the beach. So then people stopped going to the beach, did away with tourism money, and they had to clean up the trash because it hurt the economy. So there really is no way. And burning trash is one way to perhaps get rid of it and perhaps generate energy. But a lot of items that we could potentially burn do release some harmful chemicals that we have to figure out how to handle. There are ways to install what are called scrubbing systems into smokestacks that can reduce some of those chemicals or at least trap them, because burning plastic is going to release some potentially toxic chemicals. And then how can we handle that so that we're not contaminating the atmosphere by decreasing our contamination of the lithosphere and the geosphere? So we're frequently going to be balancing how we handle issues in each of these spheres with each other. How many of you would think of yourself as kind of like big picture scientists, where you like to see how things are interacting on a large scale? I think for me, that's what I like about ecology and about environmental science issues, is that we are seeing big interactions. I'm going to have a lab this afternoon where we're going to use microscopes. I can use microscopes. I don't love microscopes. I don't ever want to teach cell biology and molecular biology, not because I don't think that they're wonderful, important classes, but because it totally does not interest me as what I love to talk about. But seeing how the plants and the animals and the soil and the water and the bacteria and everything all interact together, that fascinates me, and that's what I love. And because of that, that's sometimes going to be the approach that I take. I have a hard time separating things from each other in the ecosystem when I want to look at the effects that something has. There are ways to do it, and we'll talk about a couple of them a little bit today. But you will see that in a lot of this, that there's a lot of interrelationships, and we may not be able to separate out the problems from each other or the solutions from each other. Or sometimes one problem is going to cause one solution will cause additional problems. There will be unintended consequences. I would ask you to tell me the parts of the scientific method, the steps. What would you tell me they are? Observation, hypothesis, experimentation, conclusions, right? But those are our 4 steps of our scientific method. But this scientific process and how we handle doing science contains a lot of other things. For most people, it either starts with curiosity or a need to do something or a need to solve something. So a lot of scientists come from things because they're curious about it. Or perhaps, if you're talking about medicine, because you want to cure a disease, so you're fulfilling something that you need to do or that you want to do. The curiosity is going to be very, very important for a lot of scientists. We want to know why things are the way they are, how they work that way, and if we change them, what's going to happen? Many of you would probably say that you're a little bit skeptical about things. It's going to play into science too. Because you want to know, well, is that really how it works? I don't know, that seems like a really simple explanation for me. You want to test it. You want to know seriously, is this how things happen? Data must be able to be reproduced for you to believe something. When something becomes a scientific theory, it's because we've proven it time and time and time again, and all of the results keep coming to the same conclusions. When you read a scientific paper, they have that method section in there. And the reason that it's in there is in case you go, I don't know if I believe this, you could duplicate their experiment and see if it actually works. Having published a paper where I was told by someone that point blank my methods didn't work, we discovered it was because, well, they did, just in my ecosystem and not theirs. And they were like, wait, how did you do that? How exactly did that work? We tried something like that in Massachusetts and it didn't work. Why does it work in Delaware? And we discovered it had a lot to do with the sand beach structure and the groundwater flow that we had there, as opposed to their muddier beaches that they were dealing with. That made all the difference in the world. The peer review process. Are any of you familiar with that process at all? So if I write a paper, I can't just publish it. I just send it to a journal. It then is read by the editors, some of the editors. It's going to be assigned to multiple reviewers. I'm not going to know who those reviewers are. They are going to make comments on it, send things to the editor, and then recommend whether or not they think it's worth publishing. Sometimes there's multiple rounds and rounds of edits, because we want to be sure that the work that we publish is meaningful and real. Every so often, something gets published that isn't real. There was a study that I remember reading in grad school and thinking, this is not possible, that 40% of the water in the Atlantic bight that goes across from current that goes from North Carolina over to England comes from groundwater. That's impossible. It can't possibly be 40%. It was published. The journal had to retract the article because the author had made a mistake in his calculations. It wasn't 40%. It was somewhere between 0.4 and 4%, but he'd made a mistake. No one had caught it in the peer review process. Some very interested physical oceanographers found it, read it. They said, all right, great, we want to see all of your equations. Can you send us all of your math, all of your data? And they redid his data for him, and they found where he had transposed a decimal point and a 0. And they printed a retraction. I believe it was published in either Science or Nature, so they had to have a big retraction. But it happens. And science allows you to think critically and creatively in a lot of different ways. And I mentioned that it's sometimes hard to separate out things, but that's where models come into play. If I asked you to, somebody give me an ecosystem that you want to know something about. Rainforests? If I asked you to study something about, let's go with primates and rainforests. Could you do that? But what if I only wanted you to look at one portion of rainforest? Does that make it much harder? Because the primates are going to be moving. And they might have food that's over here, or they might need to find a mate that's over there. Maybe they're going to disperse. Maybe they migrate. Maybe sometimes of the year they're here and other times they're there. We don't really know. So suddenly, it's a little more complicated. And then what if I said instead of all primates, just one species? Would that work? Would that be a lot easier? It might be. We frequently do use a model species for looking at an ecosystem where we'll look at one thing. In microbiology, a lot of times we have model, and in genetics, there's model organisms. And in medical research, we have mouse models that we use for things. That makes it simplified. We'll see if something works in a mouse model, and then we'll put it in something else. But we see that in environmental science, we do this as well. We might pick a model organism, or instead of experimenting on the entire rainforest, I'm going to take a couple places within the rainforest. We're going to pick smaller portions of it to use as a simplified system. And we'll see, okay, how does it work in this plot? Some of you took ecology recently. You had to do an aquatic invertebrate lab, correct? Were you able to measure all of the aquatic invertebrates on campus? No. How many places did you measure them from?
4.
But could you make then generalized trends about what it might be like throughout the rest of the system?
Probably, yeah.
Absolutely. And we do this a lot. Sometimes it's through observing things in smaller settings, but sometimes we build mathematical models. Climate change, we build mathematical models for. Looking at water flow issues, we build mathematical models for. So things that we can use a mathematical equation, we do that. A lot of times we also build box models. I built a lot of box models in my master's and my PhD work. I worked on how nitrogen, phosphorus, silica, and carbon cycle through salt marshes and beaches. We had this really great idea when we went into it. We thought that whatever nitrate went into the beach from groundwater would be pretty similar to the amount of nitrate that came out of the beach's groundwater. Does that make sense? Because it's just going through sand, right? So it should be comparable. And we figure if there's no ammonia going in, there probably shouldn't be any ammonia coming out. Well, sure, right. Not true at all. Lots of ammonia going into the beach. No nitrate going into the beach. No ammonia coming out. All nitrate coming out. So our beach then became a box. Our box model. We knew it was going in, and we knew it was coming out. We then had to piece together what was happening inside of that box. So you measure your inflows, you measure your outflows, and you try to determine what's happening inside of the system. What we discovered, which when we think about it makes obvious sense, is that, well, sure, it's passing through the sand, but the sand is not sand. It's sand with microbes and crabs and snails and birds and all sorts of things that are living on it and in it and working with it, and that the water moving through the small pore spaces is interacting constantly, and that there is a large enough bacterial and archaeal load in these beaches that it completely changes how nitrogen cycles through, that everything is passing through the nitrogen system as it's happening through the beach. And the length of beach we're talking about is about from that wall to where I'm standing here. So the fact that it was happening in that small of a distance changed the amount of bacterial load we understood as being in the beach. especially when you're also talking a depth of, I don't know, an active depth of the beach that was probably about, no more than 6 feet. So it's not a lot of sand at the highest. And then as you got towards the tide line, obviously it was lower. We didn't expect that. No one really expected that, but it's true. We do this when we give humans medications. We know a medication is going to work to treat a disease. We don't know how it's going to affect it when you take it. So then we have to study what are the effects going to be in the body and why did this medication or this vaccine or something work or not work. So we look at our ecosystems, our organisms as box models. And every time you build a model, you then compare it to your data. Does it reflect what I'm seeing? Does it not? Do I need to revise my model? Do I need to revise my understanding of how things work? And then once you've built a model, you might be able to make some predictions off of it. Those predictions are going to give you a range of variables. I remember being pretty disappointed with one of the models that I built in graduate school because I found that my numbers were, let's say it was like 5 plus or minus with my range of certainty 2. I was like, well, that's not much. That means, okay, so I'm saying it's 5 plus or minus 2, so that means I think it's somewhere between 3 and 7. That 5 is not really meaningful. An advisor looks at me and goes, yeah, but it's not 5 plus or minus 6 like somebody else just did with one of their models. Your range of variable is smaller than your actual number. That's good. And there are environmental models where the range of variation is larger than the actual number that it produces, which means we can't predict things with them. If I had a model that told you I could predict weather for tomorrow and I told you it was going to be 50 degrees plus or minus 40 degrees, how many of you would tell me that's a really good forecast for the entire year, regardless of season? But if I told you it was going to be on Friday 58 degrees plus or minus 3 degrees, that's pretty good. And that's the type of thing that some models can do, is you want to always constantly get to one that predicts better. And models are not always right. Somewhere out there, there's a climate model that predicts that we should have been in an ice age or going into an ice age by now. We're not. Why we're not has a lot to do with many factors, not the least of which is that the formula could be wrong. And not every model, not every prediction works the same in every ecosystem. I mentioned that something I did in Delaware didn't work in Massachusetts. But we frequently also find that something that works, let's say some of you did a study on macroinvertebrates on campus. Would you agree that the ones you found in the stream are very different than the ones you're going to find in the woods? Because there's a difference between land and water. So we find that the setting of the ecosystem is as important perhaps as its location. When you hear the term resources, how many of you think of things like water, soil, food, oil? The natural resources that we're used to getting. Do any of you think about ecosystem services? Like the ability of salt marshes and wetlands to clean and filter water, or that the ground and the bacteria in it can also detoxify water, that a farm produces food is a service. So resources are not just necessarily things we get, but also services that the environment can provide. And then we have the classic renewable versus non-renewable. Some things may not fit either category. Water is one that we've always talked about as a renewable resource. But there are questions now as to whether or not that is true everywhere, because in some places where they're suffering from significant droughts, water is not renewable until you get more rainfall again and they get outside of that drought. And there's a question that with changing climate patterns, will water that has been renewable in some areas not be? Geothermal energy is talked about as being renewable in the sense that the Earth always gives you more, but we'll see that you can't just keep recycling it back through the system. It gives you more and it leaves. So we'll see that those are a little bit more complicated as we talk about energy. And hopefully you've learned this before. The sun is our ultimate source of energy to the entire planet. It provides us with wind, it provides us with waves, it provides the organisms, the photosynthetic organisms, with what they need in order to create sugars, which provides the rest of us with everything we need, and therefore gave us coal and oil and natural gas. So the sun is the ultimate source of life, provided I overlook chemiosynthetic bacteria and archaea, which are usually found at the bottom of the ocean and a few other places where they are capable of doing the equivalent of photosynthesis but without light, using chemicals as opposed to light. So there are a few places where this theory no longer holds entirely true, but there are not nearly enough of them to provide the rest of us with our needs. So we still think of the sun as the ultimate source of energy for everything on the planet. This is a food chain versus a food web. So if those concepts were still problematic, hopefully they're not now. I believe that this concept is something you should be familiar with, the idea that chemicals cycle, whereas energy flows through ecosystems. So energy is lost at each step in the food chain, but the chemicals are maintained. And when something dies, it is recycled. Those chemicals can be reused. They're going to be broken down by the bacteria, by the fungi, by whatever their detritivores are. They're going to be used by them, and then eventually they're going to pass back into the soil where they become reavailable for plants again so that they can be used. But energy doesn't work that way. From the food that you eat, you can utilize all the nutrients, or they will pass through you and be recycled back into the system. But how much of the energy that you eat are you actually capable of using to do something?
It's not like 10%.
10%. Yep. And we expect about 10% of it is passed on from biomass level to biomass level. In some of them, because of the amount of work you have to do to find food, this isn't true for us. It's like less than 1%. For your large animals that need to go over a large area in order to find food, they spend so much energy searching for food that they have to eat enough of it, but only about 1% of it is going to make biomass in their bodies. Chemical cycling is driven by nature. I could spend an entire semester easily on chemical cycles. My specialty in oceanography is biogeochemistry, so nitrogen cycle is my friend. If you ever want to talk nitrogen cycle, let me know. I know so many steps, and I'm so sad that Dr. Dubé did not get to cover anammox with you guys in ecology, because it is my favorite step. They are archaea that take ammonia and directly make nitrate, and we never knew that that was possible. And the archaea that do this have organelles inside of their bodies, which archaea don't have organelles. And the chemical that they make as a byproduct, or as an intermediary product from going from ammonia to nitrate, is remarkably chemically similar to rocket fuel. It's my favorite part of the nitrogen cycle, hands down. There's this idea that we could eventually use them in order to make fuel, which, can you imagine, like, things that could like run on having archaea producing chemicals for them? But in order to get the chemicals from the archaea, we'd have to kill them. So maybe it's not going to work. But it's a really strange process that we just theorized and no one thought was real, because we didn't know anything that could actually do it, because you would need microorganisms that have organelles, and microorganisms don't have organelles if they're not eukaryotes, unless they're archaea, and then they sometimes do. And that's just one step of the nitrogen cycle. Yeah. These systems are driven by biology, sure, but also solar. We are working on developing plastics that will degrade from sunlight. Some of them already do, but that will degrade rapidly with sunlight. Anyone know why?
Why they degrade, or
why we want to develop them?
So they're not taking up space.
Not taking up space, but specifically because they're not taking up space in the ocean.
Yeah.
Plastics are a massive, massive trash problem in the ocean. There is the trash island in the South Pacific that's like larger than the state of Texas and like 6 feet deep.
If it was degraded by the sun, though, then where would it go? Like, if it's still...
That it would break apart and that it would break down entirely from sunlight exposure.
Into like its basic chemical.
Into basic chemical components
Okay.
that would be non-toxic is the goal. Wouldn't that be amazing? Because we find that sea turtles, birds, things like that are found every year that have died when they do autopsies on them to find out what happened because their stomachs are full of microplastics. Where the plastic does break down now, but it breaks down into small pieces. And then they see the small pieces and the turtles go, oh, look, that's food. And they eat a lot of it and that was plastics. And then it clogs up their digestive tract and they starve. So we're looking to find ways to do plastics that are going to be photo and biodegradable. We can make plastics now from corn husk. That's biodegradable. There are some companies that are reaching more into that. Amtrak uses corn husk plastics for their cutlery on their trains. The Teva flip-flops and sandals people, if you look, a lot of their hangers that their flip-flops come from are actually made of corn husk plastics. And some of your companies that are a little bit more outdoors focused are moving into that faster than others. There are a lot of companies that are now switching also to paper packaging if they can that's fully recyclable. So sun should be able to break things down. We're working to try and figure out how that can help with chemical cycling. This is the water cycle in a very simplified version, and it's the water cycle in an area where there are people with a wastewater treatment plant and pollution and so forth. We will spend a couple weeks on water later, so we will come back to this. Whereas this is the carbon cycle, and we'll come back to this a number of different times in different ways. Do you agree with the statement that we live in a high consumption, high waste society? And that we're using a lot of high quality things and we're making things that are pretty low quality from them? So we take raw materials, we use a lot of energy to make them into something that is then disposable. So we're using things up, making trash, making problems for ourselves. We take high quality energy, we burn it to create electricity, we release a lot of heat that could be used to do other things, and instead it just goes up into the atmosphere and it leaves, and we're left with a relatively low quality use of energy from what could provide us with more energy. A student a number of years ago who talked about his local landfill. Landfills, as things decompose, release methane gas. Local landfill had made a decision that what they usually do with it is flame it, and then it just kind of goes away and it burns up in the atmosphere. They were no longer just going to flame it and allow it to burn up and leave. They were going to attach somehow all of this to make sure that the heat, as they flamed off the methane, would bypass through areas where it would heat their water, and that they could utilize excess heat from that as steam to go through and heat their buildings. That they were reducing their need for electricity by harnessing the methane that was already being produced by the landfill. Because methane gas is natural gas. And people were just shocked that they could do that. And they said it made sense. And in the long term, it saved them money. So they were using something, but also saving a lot of money in the long term. We could do more of that than we actually do. But it costs money, and it requires somebody to think through, think a little bit creatively, a little bit critically in order to make that happen. I think it's a BuzzFeed video or something. Every so often somebody sends it to me and goes, this woman is cool. Do you think we could ever live like her? The woman who produces like less than a grocery size bag of trash every year. How many of you think you could live like that for a week? Maybe. Especially if you didn't have to eat in the cafeteria and you could like get all of your own things. But how many think you could do a month? it doesn't work well with our society, does it? Does anyone know if Starbucks still gives you money off if you bring your own mug to get coffee?
Yeah.
I know Wawa still does. I was at Starbucks last night and they have a water bottle on clearance, a water bottle for $40. A 16-ounce metal water bottle for $40. And I'm like, really? Because I totally got that almost identical water bottle at Target for like $10, but okay. That's part of it, is we have to start, and there's an investment there. You spend $10 on a water bottle, but for $10, I probably could have bought, I don't know, 3 packs of like 24 water bottles, right? So if I'm thinking short term, it makes sense to just buy the 3 packs, and then I don't have to worry about washing my bottle and filling it in. Environmental degradation. Drought, deforestation, trash. Those are just the starts of environmental degradation. We're going to spend some time talking about these issues. But it's not enough that we talk about, these are really bad, they're really horrible, isn't it really sad all of this is happening? I want to add more to that conversation because, yes, it's sad it's happening. It's also unacceptable that it's happening. So how do we start thinking through how to make this not happen? Because if we just sit there and go, okay, bad things happened, that's really sad, we're all upset, we're going to sit here and be depressed about it, we're not doing anything good, we're not doing anything useful, and I think we're working against the purposes that we're supposed to do as Christians, as scientists, as people who I think are pretty dedicated to caring about others and doing justice work. We have to take things a step further, if not for people, for the animals and for the environment. Because drought affects landslides. In an area that's prone to a lot of drought, suddenly they get a lot of rain, they get a massive landslide. The water can't be maintained within the soil. Because over a long period of time in an area that receives very little rain, the soil loses its water holding capabilities because you get a different type of soil there over a massive long period of time. Also, when you build a lot of houses on an area where soil's not really prone to holding much water, there's a lot of weight added for when that soil does get wet, things start to move. It's part of the problem with the landslides in California that you hear about every year, is we're putting a lot of weight on areas that can't possibly support these massive, massive mansions under wet conditions, and things start sliding. Water pollution, air pollution, endangered species. All of these are related to our misuse of resources and land and air and water. Our ecological footprint as U.S. citizens is larger than that of just about any other country in the world, significantly larger than most of them. We use a lot of resources, more than anybody else. You can see in the top graph where we'll be if we continue living unsustainably versus if we can attempt to live sustainably. That line there is the number of, that dotted line is the number of Earths it will take to support human life. If we continue living the way we are right now, the World Wildlife Fund predicts that we would need an Earth that is 30% larger than the one that we're currently living on to support human use. We cannot make a larger Earth, so we have to do something in order to fix that. So what do we do? Well, your textbook mentions that there's 3 scientific principles for sustainability. It stole them from someone named Miller. One is to use solar and wind energy, to not use fossil fuels, to not develop necessarily just hydropower, because hydropower is not actually going to work in most places in the world. We're lucky to live in the United States where hydropower is effective. Most places don't have the right types of streams in order to do this. Solar energy, wind energy is not going to create any pollution. It is freely available, so once we create technologies that are cheap enough, it is going to be cheaper than utilizing fossil fuels. We should also capitalize on the chemical cycles that exist. That instead of making trash that doesn't degrade, we should change the way that we use things. We should recycle things. We should learn to mimic chemical cycling that's done in the environment. And that instead of putting pounds of fertilizer on a farm field to make the soil healthier, we should actually make the soil healthier first. That we shouldn't just think about slapping a Band-Aid on everything. We should think about redoing how we handle things. It's been likened to the idea of you don't put a Band-Aid on like a bullet wound, but that's sometimes what we do when we're trying to solve a problem we don't know how. It's like, okay, we'll just try this. And sure, maybe it'll stop the bleeding for like half a second, but we can't focus on that. We also need to prioritize biodiversity, which means preserving species, but preserving ecosystem types, health of the land, and also, I'm going to throw out a word many of you were probably not expecting in this, genetics. Conservation genetics is a huge issue. Cheetahs are more than 99% genetically identical from what we can find. One disease could potentially wipe them out. That's bad. Genetic variation is important for allowing things to adapt to a changing environment, but beyond that, for allowing things to handle the threat of disease. We grow, for the most part, about 10 varieties of rice, a few varieties of corn. We have started these seed projects that keep the heirloom varieties so that we have the seeds, because if a disease comes through that starts wiping out the types of wheat and corn and rice that we grow, that's going to cripple the world food supply. And genetic variation is seen in the heirloom varieties, so we keep them around. Also, like things like heirloom tomatoes just look prettier on your plate than having all of the same type. What is Eastern doing to care about sustainability?
Just make a large portion of the energy renewable.
All of our energy is solar and wind. And Eagle Learning Center has solar cells on the building. When it was built, they installed them to produce energy on campus. We were one of the first universities in Pennsylvania to sign on to solar energy. We were the second university in Pennsylvania to sign on to support wind farms. We were just behind Franklin and Marshall. What do we not do? We do not recycle.
That's what I was gonna say. I don't understand how recycling works at Eastern because
It doesn't.
There's one recycling dumpster behind Eagle.
And there's one by the gym.
Does that go into recycling though? Why is it there?
I hope they do. And in the past, when students have asked and when faculty have asked, there haven't been answers.
Okay, because there's I just realized that this year because I've always had a recycling closet on my hall and you put stuff in there, but then we realized that
it just goes in the trash.
The dumpster.
Yeah, part of it is that as soon as something gets contaminated, the janitorial staff has to throw it away. Like if there's banana peels or tissues that somebody tosses in with the recyclables, then suddenly that's all trash by the standards of how things are handled. So part of it is that we don't handle this well. The recycling bins, though, are often what people find in the hallway and not the trash cans. And the trash cans are actually, there's a number of them missing from the third floor right now.
Is it possible, I know it's possible, I don't know if it's realistic, for larger institutions to compost?
Yes, it is not going to happen here.
Okay.
Sodexo is really, okay. 4 years ago when we asked, Sodexo was very not okay with it.
Why?
Because part of it is that meat products are difficult to compost. Part of it is that they don't want to be in charge of it because if something happens and something gets in there that's problematic and the food is then grown in the soil and people get sick from it, they don't want to be liable for a lawsuit. That they don't think students are responsible enough to actually follow composting guidelines, that would all have to be thrown in the trash and it creates more of a problem for them. But I think if you educated students here, most of them would be able to go, okay, well, this is where I throw my leftover salad greens, and this is where I put my leftover bacon that I didn't eat. What about our eggs? Do we know where they come from? Chickens. There was a push a number of years ago to get Eastern to switch to free-range eggs. It did not work. It's way too expensive. But the recycling. any of you want to have the Waltonians doing some really interesting things, they can push the administration right now. Maybe get some answers. Maybe. Maybe not. Recycling would be nice. We can try. As soon as I have tenure, it's a little bit easier for me to rock the boat, but hopefully, hey. What do you know that other people are doing to care about sustainability? Or to change the amount of effect they have on the ecosystem?
Part of the reason that I'm vegan is because of the meat industry and the effect that it has on the environment. So that's the first thing.
Probably from the opposite end of the spectrum. Part of the reason I hunt is because of that. Because, like, if you ever watch like stuff like that, the way they get meat's pretty gross.
And there's a big difference between hunting a deer.
Yeah, and then having a cow, like, raised in a pen and then shooting it.
Mm-hmm. And from that perspective, if we didn't hunt deer in Pennsylvania, they have no real natural predators in this area. More of them are going to die from car accidents and things.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in like the zero waste thing, like those jars. I'm not like that hardcore at all, but I like to find ways that I can not use disposable products, and I feel like once you get started, it's a lot easier than people. I mean, there's a lot of like things you have to do, but I think it's easier than people make out to be in small ways. Like I don't think extreme, never wasting anything. It's really hard to do in society, but there are things you can do.
I mean, even a lot of stores now will take back plastic bags for recycling. I mean, that alone is a massive thing. Or I like that Target gives me 5 cents off every time I use my own reusable bag, so it saves me a little bit of money. Like a whole quarter on a total if I use 5 bags, but it's something, and I'm not having to take home plastic bags, which then I just actually put into each other and eventually return to the store for recycling. The couple of the Giant and the Acme near me, right by their front door as you enter, have these large bins for recycling all of your plastic bags. It's great.
And then there's also stores that have things for recycling glasses, recycling batteries.
Yeah, Best Buy does a lot with recycling electronics. They cannot recycle your large, big televisions, the ones that have the large depth to them. This is kind of your book's way of thinking about what are we doing now versus what could our for sustainability be. But we're going to discover as we talk through some of this semester that the problems with this relate to interplays between economics, politics, and ethics. Sometimes those are going to be working at odds. Sometimes they're going to be working together. And there are some roadblocks to all of this. It might cost more. Maybe there's risks inherent. And we'll spend some more time on these later. If you're not familiar with a cost-benefit analysis, I'd read up on that a little bit in the textbook. And there is the graph there talking about cost and benefit. And you always look for the break-even point where your costs equal your benefits. We will do chapter 2 next time. If you have questions, let me know.